Спасибо, господин.
Thank you. Thank you, President. We thank today's briefers. We thank you in particular, Danny, for your brave civil position, one shared by many Europeans and Americans whose voices do not make their way into Western media pages. Distinguished colleagues, for 3 months already, we've been seeing the death throes of the Kiev regime. This is happening in the context of the so-called strategic counteroffensive of Ukraine. According to Western propagandists, that counteroffensive was supposed to yield a military victory. Toward this end, the entire NATO military machine was thrown into the fray. Billions were spent coming from the pockets of Western taxpayers. And the result is like our proverb, which says, a mountain gave birth to a mouse. The only result of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which even the West admits, is tens of thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers and hundreds of units of destroyed, expensive Western equipment. And that equipment, as the entire world has seen, is not only unique, it's not only not unique and invulnerable to Russian weapons, but in many cases is even worse than 30-year-old Soviet-produced equipment. There's a sad state of affairs when it comes to the military training and the operational planning of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the UAF, which is tested to by captured soldiers. The full collapse of the Ukrainian military command system, the rampant corruption and the disorganization is now repelling even Western mercenaries. It's starting to dawn on those mercenaries that the only role that they have is not that of valiant fighters for Ukraine's freedom, but as just cannon fodder. And recently we learned that the main directorate of intelligence of Ukraine is recruiting all over the world, including Latin America and also asocial elements that are prepared to fight for much less money. Ukraine's army is completely corrupt, so Western weapons are creeping all over the world. They've surfaced on the black market in conflict areas in the Balkans, in Africa, Latin America, directly undermining security. The full responsibility for this is borne by Western suppliers that are ignoring all of their obligations to track the end users of their weapons. But the Western political establishment hasn't stopped. Last week, the American President Joe Biden asked Congress to give Ukraine $24 billion in addition to what was already spent. That's $113 billion in official aid. This amounts to $900 for each American family. Ordinary Americans, as polls have stated, are asking a justified question. Does the U.S. not have pressing socioeconomic problems that these colossal sums could go towards solving? Why does the American people need to pay out of its own pocket for the military ventures of the Democratic Party? The public opinion in Germany and France also opposes giving Ukrainian nationalists Taurus and Scalp cruise missiles. But the Western authorities, despite the fact that they claim to be for democracy, are completely deaf to the calls of their own citizens. They are asking the Kiev regime to continue their suicidal assault, and they're trying to justify the delivery of the volumes of equipment and weapons given. And who's benefiting from this? It's very clear that the Americans, it's not the ordinary Americans and Europeans. The military arsenals of satellite states have been emptied out, the U.S. satellite states, and they're being promised discounted Western military equipment. So the U.S. military has cleaned the market for the products from the U.S. military industrial complex's products. And it seems that the independent defense policy that the European Union wanted to create for so long has been fully subjugated to the interests of Washington. As for ordinary Ukrainians, Kiev and the Western capitals don't care about them at all. There's something chillingly cynical was recently said by President Duda, the Polish president. Right now, the Russian imperialism can be stopped cheaply because American soldiers aren't dying. That is, the lives of Ukrainian soldiers are simply thrown into these cannon fodder assaults. And in Warsaw, London, Paris, and Berlin, they're considered not only to be cheaper than the lives of Americans, but even cheaper than expensive NATO military technology. It doesn't get any more obscene than that. There is still doubt that Russia's proxy war in Russia to the last Ukrainian is deliberately turning Ukraine into an uninhabitable area that is a testing ground contaminated by radioactive elements and unexploded ordnance. The decision by London and Washington to deliver depleted uranium and cluster munitions has shocked the international community, but even their NATO allies. The Polish media is already saying that the radiation levels have increased in the eastern Polish provinces after the destruction of a storage site in Khmelnytsky. But the British and the Americans don't care about continental Europe, just like they didn't care about the aftermath of NATO's bombardment with depleted uranium in Yugoslavia. Cluster bombs, when they're used in violation of IHL in civilian areas, which is what Kiev is doing, poses a severe threat to civilians. This is why Laos and Cambodia ask Ukraine not to use these weapons. These two countries have seen firsthand the serious repercussions due to their use in the context of American aggression. Washington itself has pinned a label of war criminals on anybody and moralized about this, anybody that used these weapons. It seems that, according to their logic, Zelensky and his henchmen should be war criminals, and you're the ones who directly aiding and abetting him, and you have the full responsibility for past and future crimes. There are assurances we've heard from the West that the weapons used in Ukraine are not going to be used in violation of IHL. This is a direct lie. The Kiev regime has been using them using cluster bombs to strike areas in the Donetsk which have no military targets. Their only goal is to sow terror among the civilians, which directly runs counter to IHL, but that fits into the tactics of the Kiev regime, who has already openly resorted to terrorism. In this context, there's no real military advantage afforded by cluster bombs, and Washington understands that very well. In contrast to the U.S., Russia's stance when it comes to the use of cluster munitions is consistent and fully hews to the norms and requirements of IHL. Our American colleagues have foamed at the mouth in this hall, rejecting saying that they didn't develop biological weapons in laboratories on Ukrainian territory, and they blocked the Russian-initiated investigation of this issue in the context of the CWC. But what are you going to say now that a presidential candidate from the Democrats, Robert F. Kennedy, has been confirming these facts? There's no doubt that the people of Ukraine going forward also will want to learn about how the U.S. de facto used its population as guinea pigs for their own military and biological experiments. Colleagues, everyone who is guilty for this crime and for many crimes that the Kiev regime has committed with Western backing since 2014 will be found and will be punished. This process is already in full swing. I'll give you some examples. A 25-year sentence was recently handed down to a commander of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion. His name, Anatoly Kilyushkin. A 24-year sentence was handed down to Pavel Artemenko, who is a soldier in the Azov battalion, and to Anton Rakanyuk. They shelled residential areas in the DPR last spring. A 21-year sentence to Vitaly Minuka, who killed a civilian in Mariupol. A life sentence to the Ukrainian soldier Vasily Shitre, who killed 4 residents of Mariupol. A Ukrainian Marine, Vladimir Pafitsevich, and Yevgeny Vakhnenko have been given 22-year sentences for killings of residents of Mariupol. Since the last meeting, we've seen an increase in the number of civilian sites struck by Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems. We all know about the Transfiguration Cathedral in Odessa that was hit, and Ukrainians also struck a supermarket. The Ukrainian social networks are calling upon citizens to be afraid of the work of anti-aircraft systems which are deployed in residential areas in contravention of humanitarian laws. The Ukrainians understand that Russian high-precision weapon strikes on military sites pose no threat to the civilians. The Russian authorities, however, are making substantial progress in Kharkov Oblast, and they're prepared to liberate Kupiansk. But this trend has been hushed up by the Kiev regime. They, however, have announced the forced evacuation of 37 towns, including Kupiansk. This is not surprising because a substantial share of the civilians have sympathy, are well disposed to Russia, and they are preferring not to wait for the Russian forces to come. Yet Zelensky's regime hasn't shied away from stealing children from their parents that are hiding them from Ukrainian patrols in basements. This threat is faced in Kupiansk by 500 people. We'd like to call it up for the UN and our Western colleagues in the Security Council to pay attention to these flagrant violations of IHL in Ukraine. We'll document it and we'll continue to make it public so we can find the victims. The people of Ukraine is starting to understand very well that the Kiev regime is pressing it to engage in suicide for the Western country's agenda. One clear example is seen in the Ukrainian media. Since the early 2022, from Ukrainian embassies abroad, around 60% of diplomats have returned. If you believe the Ukrainian journalists, then 20 embassy staff were supposed to return from the U.S., but only one of those staff members returned. There's a failure of the aggressive Russophobic policy in Ukraine. The Ukrainian leadership has to know about that, but Vladimir Zelensky has driven himself into a dead end in his country, and his only way out is to beg for weapons at Western summits. These Western weapons are not bringing peace any closer, as Western delegations have said. The only thing they're doing is keeping Zelensky's regime afloat. But no matter how much they try, sooner or later the Ukrainian people, which has paid such a high price for these Western geopolitical interests, will ask the right questions and will hold to account the true architects of this crisis. Many of them, as you understand, are represented in this hall, and today they're going to continue their unconvincing mantra that there's a need to continue military aid to Ukraine, which is a victim of aggressive. But the number of people that are saying that is ever dwindling. All of our international parties understand the reasons for the Ukrainian crisis, and they know that the weapons deliveries are stopping the attempts to find an answer. And this trend is a direct result of our spotlighting this issue in the UN Security Council. That's why we'll continue this work, whether or not the henchmen of the Kiev regime like it or not. Thank you.